While we're talking about gender and gender roles in ancient literature, I'd like to introduce you to a set of symbols that is pretty common throughout literature and art, and those are phallic symbols, which are supposed to give archetypally or stereotypically male qualities to the subject they're associated with, and the somewhat less famous but equally significant Yonic symbols, which are representations of wombs or vaginas, which are supposed to attribute feminine qualities or powers to the subjects they're associated with. You are looking at a picture of a king. In his right hand is a scepter. And what does a scepter do? What is it for? It's not a weapon. It's not a tool. You don't use it to reach across the banquet table and stab a particularly good-looking piece of food and bring it back to your plate. It's just a symbol, and it symbolizes this man's right to rule. Now you're looking at the Eiffel Tower. Um, Once again, what is the point of the Eiffel Tower? It doesn't have apartments or offices. It doesn't serve any sort of military purpose. It's just, at least in its original incarnation, it was just an expression of the industrial power of France, the technological power of France, and the economic might of France in the 1800s when it was built. And while we're talking about this symbol of France's um, power, let's talk about the Washington Monument, of course, which is a very similar structure in Washington, D.C. It reaches up into the sky. It stands in some way for America, maybe the American government, but it doesn't really serve any sort of purpose as far as, economic, industrial. No one lives there. No one works there. I guess it probably has a guard. The Washington Monument is based off of these ancient objects, which are most famously erected in Egypt. They're called obelisks, and these too didn't really serve what you would call a practical or a material purpose. They generally bore some kind of message about the authority and legitimacy of the pharaoh who put them up. And so all of these things are something that I would call phallic symbols. Yes, they are named phallic symbols because they are in some way or another penis shaped, but they really aren't sexual in nature. Rather, phallic symbols, when you see them in art and literature, they usually are some kind of representation of power that is deemed to be a masculine sort of power. And so I would say that a phallic symbol might mean political power, like with the king's scepter. And a phallic symbol might mean economic power. And sometimes a phallic symbol actually represents the power to do violence. So, and all of those are traits that, historically speaking, are thought to be masculine traits. Bear in mind that when we think about the habits of mind of our ancient ancestors, they often did believe in gender stereotypes, and they did believe that some characteristics were inherently male and some were inherently female. Um, One of literature's greatest phallic symbols is probably the sword and the stone, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of from Arthurian legend. Um, the unrecognized young boy, Arthur, is able to pull the sword from the stone, and that proves that he's the legitimate son of Uther Pendragon and the right-wise king over all of England. And so this sword is not so much significant as a weapon as it is a symbol of political power and authority and legitimacy. Here you see a United States Marine in his dress uniform, and he's holding a sword. And that's kind of strange because I don't think in a modern war and the kind of conflicts that a modern Marine gets involved in, there's never an opportunity to use a sword. Um, so I would say that this sword is a phallic symbol. It's a weapon, sure, but really it's a symbol of the kind of man who wields this weapon. It's a symbol of somebody who is capable of and authorized to commit violence rather than it really having any practical use. I would be interested to know when was the last time a U.S. Marine killed somebody with a sword in battle? I don't think it happens very often. It's a symbol, a phallic symbol. Um, to go in another direction, we often, when we want to depict the sort of the corporate fat cat, the capitalist, and we want to sort of illustrate his economic power, we often give him a cigar, which could also be considered a phallic symbol. Sometimes animals are associated with phallic symbols as well. Uh, Animals that have horns or antlers are often seen as symbols of masculinity, especially because in those animal species, it's usually the male that grows, the larger horns, the more elaborate horns. And so we already discussed a little bit how the bull was symbolic of sort of masculine power in Crete when we talked about Theseus and the Minotaur. And in this illustration, we can see a stag, which would be another popular symbol, at least in Europe, uh, because of the obviously the mighty antlers that a stag, a male deer, will sprout. Snakes can also be considered to be phallic symbols. Um, we've seen snakes in a number of myths already, often in a negative capacity. So this could be sort of focusing on the negative, scary, or threatening aspects of masculinity that come along with serpents. Although I should say that serpents aren't universally evil in mythology, but it does happen a whole lot. Let's talk about Jack and the Beanstalk, because that is a children's fairy tale that I think really ties to a lot of the issues that we have been talking about. Um, there is no sex in Jack and the Beanstalk, but yet I think a phallic symbol is still very central to the story in the form of the beanstalk itself. This is what I think the story is about. One interpretation, right? Not necessarily the correct interpretation, but um, Jack is a boy. And Jack's dad is gone. I guess he's probably dead. And there really is nobody who is the man of the house. Um, and Jack's mom watches over him. And one day, Jack's mom trusts him with a grown up task, a manly task, in fact. She asks him to go to the marketplace and sell their old cow. He's selling the old cow because her milk has run dry. And I think that's a really good metaphor for the end of childhood, the time when you have to stop drinking from the teat, and make your own way in the world. And so Jack has the grown-up man's economic responsibility to go into the marketplace and trade for um, the providing of his family. And so he goes to the marketplace with this cow and he sells her for a handful of magic beans. That's dumb. That's not a good deal. Jack got played because he is a little child. And he comes home to his mom, and his mom says, you screwed up. And she throws the beans out the window and she sends him to bed without eating any supper. And that is a child. A child tried to do a grown up task and failed. And then he got punished by his mom. And so that was Jack's last night as a child, because the next morning he grows up and sprouting out of the ground is a beanstalk that's just grown up miraculously overnight. Those of you who have watched an adolescent boy grow up, maybe it could even tie that to the rapid changes that happened, to this young person. But Jack sees this beanstalk and says, "I'm going to take on that challenge," and he climbs it, although it's certainly dangerous. And up at the top of that beanstalk, he meets a giant, he fights a giant, he kills the giant, and he comes back down with the giant's treasure. And that includes a singing harp and, most importantly, a goose that lays golden eggs. And with that goose that lays golden eggs, he's going to be able to provide for his family forever. And so now all of a sudden he is able to, meet the economic responsibilities that fall upon him as the man of the house. Yesterday he was a boy, but today, he climbed up this giant phallic symbol. He had the capacity to do violence because he killed this giant, and most importantly, by the time he returns from this quest, he has the economic power to be the head of the household and provide his mom with all the golden eggs she can eat. I'm just kidding. They're going to sell the eggs for money and they're going to live like kings. So, yeah, I think this is basically a story about a boy becoming a man, and at its heart is this, what to me is an obvious phallic symbol. While we're on the subject of sexual symbolism in fairy tales, let's talk about Little Red Riding Hood. Uh, I believe that fairy tales are usually designed to teach children lessons, and I don't think that the lesson of Little Red Riding Hood is watch out for wolves. Um, I don't really think that wolves eat that many children. Certainly not in Europe in the 1800s, which is where we get our the version of Little Red Riding Hood that we know best. And Moreover, I just don't think that this story tells us anything about how to avoid a wolf, because the animal in this story doesn't act like a wolf. A wolf would just jump out of the bushes and start biting at a child. But this animal, it wants to walk along with Little Red Riding Hood. It wants to ask her about her day. It wants to take the place and the appearance of somebody that she is going to trust, and then take advantage of that trust to hurt her. And that's just not how wolves act. But it is sometimes how men act. And so I think that's ultimately what Little Red Riding Hood is trying to teach us. Well, not sorry, not me. What it's trying to teach little 19th century German girls. Um, if you want to walk that path to grandma's house, which maybe could mean if you want to walk the path of a woman, become a mother, then a grandmother, the matriarch of a large family, you need to watch out for men who act like wolves, for men who will, pretend to be someone you trust only to betray you, because that can be very dangerous for a girl, much more dangerous than wolves. At the time of the Brothers Grimm or today, men pose a much greater danger to women than wolves do. And also, when you keep in mind the importance that culture placed on girls keeping their virginity until they were of marriageable age, um, being seduced by a sweet talking man like this wolf probably represents could really interfere with a girl's ability to be married to a high quality husband and set herself on a good economic path for being successful later in life. So yeah, I think that this story warns little girls about men. Let's point to the Yonic symbolism. So in the same way that phallic symbolism refers to a phallus or penis, Yonic symbolism refers to a yoni, and that is the Sanskrit word for a vagina. Sometimes it's more of a womb. But when we look at Little Red Riding Hood, her hood itself, could represent or be reminiscent of a part of the female anatomy. And then, of course, even though I don't believe the Brothers Grimm mentioned this, Little Red Riding Hood is always carrying a basket, a closed basket with goodies inside it, which I think could also be seen as a Yonic symbol. Pretty much anything that is hollow and could hold something inside it, which could be a box or a jar, a well or a cave, a cup, a bowl. Often these things are seen as being similar in appearance to vaginas or wombs, and therefore are Yonic symbols associated with some attributes and powers that are attributed to women. The sculpture that you're looking at right now is a sacred object, and you could see different variations on that sacred object. The same sort of sculpture in both ancient and modern India, and it's called a Lingam Yoni. And the larger part on the bottom is the yoni, and then the stone peg that's sticking out of the yoni is the lingam, which is a phallic symbol. And so, these two powerful objects combine are a symbol of fertility in India, in Hinduism, and you can see that people have made offerings to this divine principle of fertility, flowers and rice and herbs. And when you would make an offering to a symbol of fertility like this, you might be saying, well, I hope for a safe and healthy pregnancy and childbirth for a friend or a member of the family. Or you might be saying, I hope all of the animals on my farm, have healthy childbirths and lots of new, cows and goats next season. Or you might be talking about the fertility of the land itself. I hope to grow lots of great crops, and please make sure that my fields are fertile. All of those might be reasons that you would make an offering to a divine representation of fertility like this one. Thrice the brindled cat hath mewed, thrice, and once the hedge pig whined. Harper cries, "'Tis time, 'tis time, round about the cauldron go, in the poisoned entrails throw. Toad, that under cold stone days and nights has 31 sweltered venom sleeping got, boil thou first in the charmed pot. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble." Those, of course, are lines from Macbeth, spoken by the three witches that have gathered around the cauldron. and that cauldron is another powerful symbol of femininity. What's in the cauldron? Nobody knows. Actually, I guess these witches do tell you some of the things that's going into their cauldron, but it sort of represents, a mystery, a formula, a sort of a science that is not known to men. There's a lot of visual representations and also language that connects fruit to femininity. You might have heard people describe a pretty girl as she's a real peach, or maybe she has a butt like an apple. Um, the pictures show how a actually resemble a woman's reproductive organs. And then, of course, fruit do have seeds inside them. And so, I think that you could say a fruit is kind of like a tree's womb. But I don't know. If you're a bio major, you might be ready to correct me on that. But I would say that I think a lot of people, whether it's biologically sound, a lot of people have made that connection throughout literary and artistic history. Um, Georgia O'Keeffe, famous 20th century American painter, liked to paint really, really close up views of flowers. So close up that they don't really look like flowers at this range. This painting is called Blue Flowers, but I think most viewers would agree that it's supposed to call to mind a vagina. Turning to mythology, in a lot of cases, Yonic symbols, one thing they might stand for is mystery and secrecy. And one good example of that is the Lady of the Lake. She lives in a lake, which itself you could say is kind of a symbolic womb. The location of this lake is hidden from everybody, and it's a real privilege for Arthur to be allowed to visit this lake and have Excalibur bestowed upon him. That's right, Excalibur is not the sword in the stone. Excalibur is a different sword that's given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake. Depending on which author you read, let's not get into that. Uh, Here we see Pandora, and again, we've got a Yonic symbol that represents mystery and secrecy because the mystery of what was inside that jar is so powerful that Pandora can't help but open that jar up. And yeah, I know that you probably think of Pandora as opening a box, but in the mythology, it was originally a jar, and then later on, somebody mistranslated the word pithos to mean box. It's a jar. It's really a jar. Um, right. This is unfortunately a kind of a negative representation of femininity, because Pandora is, like Eve, kind of held responsible for unleashing evil onto the world. But a much more positive representation of a Yonic symbol would be the Holy Grail. Once again, cannot stop talking about the Arthurian legends here in this presentation. Of course, a cup is another one of those things. It holds liquid, so it could be a, symbolic womb. Um, and the Holy Grail is supposedly the cup that Jesus Christ drank from at the Last Supper. It's actually not discussed in the Bible, but centuries later, Europeans and especially the Knights of the Round Table identify the Holy Grail as being one of the most sacred objects in all of Christianity, and it has great healing powers. And that's another thing that you might see associated with Yonic symbols. Women are often seen as having the power to nurture, to soothe, to heal, and the Holy Grail, has that very feminine characteristic of being able to cure wounds that would have otherwise been incurable. Now let's jump to the 20th century once again and talk about Star Wars. On the planet of Dagobah, the teacher, the Jedi Master Yoda, has a hidden cave, and he invites Luke to go down into that cave and confront his own dark side. A cave is a great example of a Yonic symbol, of a symbolic womb. In literature, people often go into caves and they change and they transform and they come out in a very different way. And so, yeah, Luke confronts his own dark side and hopefully comes out, at least one step closer to being a Jedi Knight. Um, and that is another power that's associated with femininity when we talk about the language of phallic and Yonic symbols. Women have the power to transform. And so we could be talking about Medusa in Greek mythology could change men into stone. Circe in Greek mythology could change men into pigs and animals, and a lot of witches in other European mythology could turn men into toads or something along those lines. So yeah, transformation is another one of those qualities that's often associated with women and with Yonic symbols. And while we're talking about caves, Let's talk about the cave of Joseph of Arimathea. This is the place where the body of Jesus was supposed to have been laid to rest. And I'm sure that many of you know the story that after the body had been resting here for 3 days, the stone that sealed the mouth of the cave was mysteriously rolled away, and the cave was empty. And so this could be another one of these instances where Jesus actually does undergo a change when he goes into this cave. Before Jesus goes into the cave, he lives basically as a human being. He does have miraculous abilities and foresight, but he walks around on 2 feet, or else he rides a donkey. He eats, he drinks, he sleeps, and he really behaves, pretty much like a human being. After he is killed and put into the cave, um, we don't really see him as a human being who walks around from place to place anymore. Mostly, Jesus appears to people in visions. He appears to people far away from each other, distantly. And so, you could say that uh, the mortal Jesus who walks the earth is sort of transformed by the experience of death and his time in the cave, into something that is more transcendent and more spiritual at this point. In many myths, caves actually represent the womb of Mother Earth, because of course they are entrances into the earth itself. Also in Christianity, there is a tradition of painting Mary, the mother of Jesus, as standing in front of a yoni. It's not part of her halo. This picture makes it very clear that the halo is distinct from the yoni. It's not entirely clear why, a lot of medieval monks and people painted this kind of thing. You would think that there would be a taboo against any sort of representation of a vagina in that culture, but it's possible that they got this idea from earlier pictures in which the Greeks and Romans portrayed their own goddesses similarly, or it might be that they weren't consciously aware that they were doing it. But in any case, this symbol probably represents Mary's status as the sacred divine mother of Christianity, not just because she gave birth to Jesus, but also because she is one of these nurturing, compassionate people who even follows Jesus to the cross to give him what little comfort she can there. Now you are looking at a picture of the Hindu goddess Kamadhenu. I'm not sure I pronounced that name correctly. Forgive me if I have not pronounced it correctly. This is a divine bovine. It is a cow goddess from India, and I'm sure that many of you are aware of the sacredness of the cow to Hindus. And really, especially in India, but I would say in many different cultures, the cow was seen as a sort of sacred feminine representation. A cow is seen as feminine because a cow feeds us with the very same milk that it feeds its own children, and that makes it sort of like our mom. And in this picture, you can see that this cow is really a symbol of bounty and plenty because her udders are just pouring milk right down onto this Lingam and Yoni sculpture, like I showed you in a previous slide. Another animal besides the cow that might be associated with femininity would be a spider. That might sometimes be a more negative connotation. Like this representation, this is Shelob from the Lord of the Rings, a giant spider that hopes to trap Frodo Baggins in her webs. And I think that some people might have associated spiders with femininity because, for one thing, a spider's body shape will often have like a really big, bulging abdomen that might remind people of a woman's pregnant belly. And then, of course, a spider's web is a series of concentric circles which could remind people of labia. Some other great literary spiders would include Arachne from Greek mythology, the girl who was arrogant enough to challenge the goddess Athena to a weaving contest and was turned into a spider for her pride. And another example would be Charlotte from Charlotte's Web, one of my childhood favorites. Charlotte is a spider in this 20th century American children's story who lives on a farm, and she's kind of a wise woman. She's kind of a nurturing, kind, sensible mother figure to all of the animals that live on the farm, mostly a pig named Wilbur. The last slide I would like for you to look at today is a grouping of mother goddess figures. And if you are able to read that small print on this slide, you can see that these sculptures come from all over the world. And they aren't maybe Yonic symbols exactly, because these are mostly representation of the whole woman, not just her reproductive parts. But a lot of them do have, very exaggerated female characteristics. They've got super wide hips, or big butts, or big breasts, or something like that. So, yeah, these are supposed to be a sort of like an exaggerated representation of a fertile woman, a pregnant woman. Um, and there's a theory, and it is only a theory because we are talking about, in many places, a time before people were writing down their history and give us written records of what their culture was like. But this theory goes that um, humankind's earliest religions may have centered not around a sky god, but around a mother goddess. Who would be a symbol of fertility, who would control, the growth of plants and the healthy birth of new human beings. And one reason why they say that is a likely story is that these mother goddess sculptures are so very prevalent through so many different cultures, much more so than representations of male gods and phallic symbols, which actually are going to come along a little later.